equals 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 title, Shanhei Pillow author, Mo Shabai Wei Yun edition. When Wei Yun was 14 years old, a whole family of men died in battle, and his family was destroyed. At that time, only his mother and his new sister-in-law accompanied him to support the Wei family. My mother said that it is not easy to be a new sister-in-law. She lost her husband just after attending church. When he develops in the future, he must find a good marriage for his sister-in-law. That's when he said, good. When Wei Yun was 20 years old, Gu Chusheng, Minister of Rights, came to propose a marriage to Chu Yu. Wei Yun went to the gate of Gu's house with a knife. He said, after entering the door of my Wei family, you must be a member of my Wei family for the rest of your life. Gu Chusheng mocked, your brother is dead, who is she? Wei Yun squeezed the knife tightly, and answered word by word, I am Wei Yun's person. Chu Yu edition. Chu Yu was for Gu Chusheng in her last life. I escaped the marriage of the royal gift and travelled 1,000 miles in the end. She still died of illness. Reborn to 15 years old, Chu Yu was on the way to escape marriage. She resolutely turned around and married into the gate of Wei family. She knew that the Wei family would be killed in battle, leaving only a 14-year-old Wei Yun to stand alone. She also knew that Wei Yun would hold up the Wei family and become the king of Zhenbei, who would dominate the government and the opposition in the future. So she thought, accompany Wei Yun through this most difficult time. Then she became the first lady of the Wei family. But she never thought that in the end, she really became the eldest lady of the Wei family. Author Weibo, Xinjiang Mo Shabai update announcements, red envelope activities, author's daily life, article exchanges. Weibo has everything. Favorite me, you can't accept the loss, favorite me, you can't be fooled. Content tab, rebirth search keywords, protagonist, Chu Yu, Wei Yun supporting role, others, comment on the work. The reborn Chu Yu married the Wei family who had escaped marriage in her previous life, trying to change the fate of Wei Yun, who was the only one left in the battlefield of the Wei family, but it backfired. So, as the eldest lady of the Wei family, she took Wei Yun, who was only 14 years old, alone, supporting a century-old high door, and groping in despair. The background of the story is grand, the rhythm is lively, the characters are rich, and the plot is full. From the death of 70,000 people in Beatty Valley, a picture of troubled times was slowly unfolded. The relationship between the male and female protagonists is naturally delicate, the heroic blood, and the love between children and children are perfectly balanced in the author's pen. She had a cool feeling on her body, and her knees hurt like needles, and it seemed that she had been kneeling for a long time. There was a familiar and distant noise outside. She is about to get married, so what if she kneels like this? I can't hear you saying these things are unreasonable, so I'll ask her if she has stepped out of the general's mansion now. If not, what is there to punish? Now you have been beaten and scolded, what are you going to do? The woman's voice was crying, you have to force Au to death, so you are willing to give up. Who? This jade carving of Bodhisattva made Chu Yu a little surprised, because this Bodhisattva was buried with her grandmother when she died. It has been nearly 10 years since her grandmother passed away. The voice clearly belonged to her mother who passed away 4 years ago. Where is this? She was astonished, and gradually remembered the last moment before she lost consciousness. It should be winter, she was lying in a heavy quilt, surrounded by black smoke produced by the burning of a low-quality charcoal stove. Someone came in with a blind, with a child less than 8 years old. She was wearing a long skirt made of water blue shoe brocade, with a feathered crane cloak outside, and round pearl earrings dangled beside her ears, gently rising and falling with her movements. She is nearly 30 years old, but she still has the innocence and beauty that is unique to a girl, which is completely different from her lying on the hospital bed. She and the woman in front of her were born at the same time, but the person in front of her is still the same as before, but she is already old and vicissitudes. Her hands were rough and full of scars, her face was full of fine lines due to long-term sorrow, and her eyes were full of death and despair. The woman came forward and saluted her respectfully, just like in the general's mansion. "Sister." Chu Yu had no strength. She dully shifted her gaze to the child beside the woman, and looked at him quietly. When the child saw Chu Yu, he did not get close at all, but took a step back, looking rather scared. Chu Yu's breathing was a little late. The woman noticed her emotional ups and downs, pushed the child, and said to the child, "Yanqing, my name is Madam." The child came forward and shouted respectfully, "Mrs." Chu Yu's pupils shrank suddenly. "Madam? What madam? She is clearly his mother." It was clear that she was the one who gave birth to him in October. Calling names doesn't work. At this moment, she has already lost the sword in her hand and the sword in her heart. She wants this child to call her mother, and she needs the sister Su Ken in front of her. "Sister, don't worry about it." Chu Yu knew that Chu Jin would not let her hear Gu Yanqing's mother, so she grabbed her and stared at her. Chu Jin looked at her quietly, and after a long time, smiled slowly. She waved her hand and let Gu Yanqing go down, then looked down at Chu Yu's eyes. "Sister looks like she can't do it anymore." Chu Yu was speechless, but Chu Jin was telling the truth. However, Gu Chusheng rejected her request. Now that she died soon, Gu Chusheng finally returned to Jianyang and said to take her back to Huajing. But she can't go back, she is doomed to die in this foreign land. Chu Jin looked at her slowly and indifferently. "Hate." She spoke calmly. Chu Yu stared at her and replied. "How can you not hate? She was the best of the best, but step by step she has fallen to where she is today. Why don't you hate her?" "But, why do you hate it?" Chu Jin said softly, "Is there anything I'm sorry for, sister?" These words made Chu Yu stunned for a while. Chu Jin raised her hand, and gently placed it on Chu Yu's hand like when she was young. "Every path is chosen by my elder sister. Ajin always listens to my elder sister, doesn't she? It was my sister who wanted to elope to marry Gu Chusheng, and Ajin helped her. It's my sister who wants to earn military merit for Gu Chusheng and lose herself in the battlefield, and has nothing to do with others. It's my sister who wants to marry Gu Chusheng, no one is forcing her, is it?" "Yes, she is going to marry Gu Chusheng." Gu Chusheng was the doll of Chu Jinding, but she fell in love with Gu Chusheng. At that time, the Gu family was in distress, and Gu Chusheng was implicated and was demoted to the border. Chu Jinlei cried to her for fear of going to the border to endure hardship. Seeing that her sister had no intention of Gu Chusheng, she asked herself to marry Gu Chusheng, the son of Wei Jun. At that time, everyone thought she was crazy, and exchanged a good marriage for a poor boy who no one dared to touch. Naturally, her loving father would not allow it, and Gu Chusheng had no intention of agreeing to her either. No one supports her feelings. She tried her best to follow Gu Chusheng to Ganyang. Gu Chusheng was moved by her friendship and was grateful for her persistence in times of crisis, so she took her. Gu Chusheng was not in the pool at all. She accompanied Gu Chusheng at the border, spent the most difficult 6 years, and gave birth to a child for him. And he rose step by step, returned to Huajing, and went all the way to the head of the cabinet. If that's all, it's a good story. 4-year-old Wei Yun supported the high school alone. At that time, Chu Jin was unwilling to be a widow for Wei Yang, so he received a letter of divorce from the Wei family and returned to celibacy. Gu Chusheng met Chu Jin, and the two of them rekindled their old love and rehabilitated. How could Chu Yu bear it at this time? Stayed in Qianyang for 6 years, until she died. She was with Gu Chusheng for 12 years. Chu Jin is right. Why should she hate it? Gu Chusheng didn't want her. She made it clear back then that she was forcing. Gu Chusheng wanted Chu Jin, but she forced them to separate because of her sacrifice. They may be wrong, but they are wrong. The fault is that she should not be obsessed with Chu Yu, and should not like the person she doesn't like. The stronger the wind and the snow, the hurried and steady steps of a man came from outside. He has always been like this, his joy and anger are invisible, and you can't see what he is thinking. After a while, the man opened the curtain and entered. He stood at the door, stopped his steps, and the wind and snow poured in, blowing Chu Yu's blood into his chest. She suddenly found out that the 12 years, no matter how deep the friendship, seemed to have given up. She looked at this man and found that she no longer loved her love had long since passed away in time, but she couldn't let go of her persistence. She didn't love him, she was just unwilling. Figured this out, she suddenly regretted these 12 years so much. 12 years ago, she should not have taken that step, should not have chased this dear lover to a foreign country, should not have thought that she could warm this cold stone with her warm heart. Gu Chus-hung, she gasped, and said softly, if I can be reborn, I hope that I can be with you and have no more entanglements. Gu Chushan's pupils shrank suddenly. After Chu Yu said this, a mouthful of blood spurted out. Chu Jin screamed in surprise. Gu Chus-hung hurried forward and took the person into his arms. His hands trembled slightly and said hoarsely, Ayu! If reborn! Chu Yu's last wish before her death echoed in her mind, and she suddenly understood something. With great ecstasy pouring into her heart, she stood up abruptly. The old lady of Chu who was chanting beside her was startled by her. Seeing her staggering out of the door, she rushed to the door and stared at General Chu and his wife who were arguing. Mrs. Chu Xiayun was being supported by Chu Jin and quarreled with Chu Jianchong. Chu Jianchong was on the verge of rage, so he controlled his emotions and said, what kind of family is the Marquis of Zhenqiu? Who do you want to marry? Who do you marry? Gu Chus-hung is a weak scholar who is comparable to Wei Shizi. Not to mention Wei Shizi, even the 14-year-old Wei Qilang of the Wei family is stronger than Gu Chus-hung. Even if there is no such relationship, I will never let my daughter marry him. I don't care what you want Ayu to do, all I know is that she was beaten by you and is still kneeling inside. Xiayun readied, this is my daughter, I don't care about the rest, I want her to be safe and sound. If something happens to your niece today, can you give me back a daughter? She has studied martial arts since childhood, you underestimate her. Chu Jianchong frowned, she has thick skin. Chu Jianchong. Xiayun raised her voice, do you remember that she is just a daughter's family? So I didn't get on the stick. Chu Jianchong blurted out. Xiayun raised her hand in anger, her face flushed, and she was about to slap down when she heard Chu Yu's hurried and delighted call, Father, Mother. The voice was not as usual, it contained too much. It seems like a traveler who has traveled thousands of miles and has gone through the vicissitudes of life. The two were stunned for a moment, turned their heads, and saw Chu Yu rushing over and slammed into Chu Jianchang's arms. Dad! The warmth came suddenly, and Chu Yu almost burst into tears. Alive, everyone is alive. Everything has not happened yet, her life is completely okay, and it will be all over again. The author has something to say. The hero is, Wei Yun. Wei Yun. Wei Yun. Don't be on the wrong side, you know. Same. The story of reborn ex-husband ex-reborn daughter ex-younger brother-in-law. This article is about my uncle being the male protagonist, and for marriage is about the ex-husband being the male protagonist, so everyone can choose. Then, I know this is the beginning of a vulgar shit. But the blood of the dog is not important, the important thing is whether it can be delicious. This author will clean up all the chores at the end of May and restore her brilliant life of ink, groundhog, tentacles, and book white. Updated on time at 8 o'clock every night. After all, Chu Yu grew up with him in martial arts since childhood, which is a little different from ordinary girls. She likes Gu Chus-hung, so she will give him anything good. The Gu family was convicted because of the rebellious King Qin, and everyone could not hide. She could send money and letters to Gu Chus-hung before she was about to get married, and she would elope with him to the border. This courage is too big. But fortunately, she was told to Chu Jianchong by her personal maid, and stopped her just before Chu Yu was about to escape, so that she did not make a big mistake. Thinking of this, Chu Jiancheng straightened his face again, and said coldly, "Have you figured it out? If you haven't figured it out yet, continue to kneel. Think about it." Chu Yu knew what Chu Jiancheng was asking. She scratched her memory. Now she should be 15 years old. In September, when she was 15 years old, she was conferred by the emperor to marry Wei Jun, the prince of the Marquis of Zhenqiu. The marriage is set, and the three Mach and Lu Ping are about to get married. As a result, it was also at this time that King Qin, who had rebelled for half a year, was finally captured and imprisoned, and Gu Chushan's father, who had been favored by Princess Qin, said a few good words for the family of King Qin, which aroused holy anger. Gu Chushan's father was beheaded, and Gu Chusheng, who had just entered the courthouse, was also implicated and was demoted to the border, from a Hanlin bachelor to a Japan county magistrate. She was anxious when she learned about this, and it happened that Chu Jin came to cry with her, and did not want to accompany Gu Chusheng to the border to suffer, so the sisters summed up and asked Chu Yu to elope with Gu Chusheng first and wait for Chu Yu after running away. The Chu family had no choice but to let Chu Jin stand on top and marry into the Marquis of Zhenqiu. Chu Jin is also the eldest daughter, but not the eldest daughter. Unlike Chu Yu, who has always been a great dancer, she follows Xia Yun to learn poetry and compose freely. The candidate for the first wife who has been thinking about it day and night will marry Chu Jin. With the relationship between the Wei family and the Chu family, the Wei family probably won't say anything. The two calculated well, so they asked the servant to report to Gu Chusheng first, and asked Gu Chusheng to leave and wait outside the city gate that day. Seeing that it was time to go, Chu Jiancheng caught him while he was climbing the wall. After she was arrested, she knelt all night, and it was Chu Jin who persuaded Xia Yun to bring her back to the room, and then secretly let her go, so she had a chance to chase all the way Gu Chusheng, who had already left. And this time, Chu Yu will never run again, so she resolutely said to Chu Jiancheng, "I won't run away, I'll be waiting to marry Prince Wei." Chu Jiancheng gave Chu Yu a suspicious look, wondering why Chu Yu suddenly changed her mind, wondering if she was trying to deceive him. However, her daughter has always been a rectal person, and she will not lie to her family when she lies. That's all, go and rest first. You're going to get married the day after tomorrow, so don't think about it anymore. Anyway, Gu Chusheng has already left, you, just die. Chu Jiancheng saw Chu Yu bowing her head, thinking she was sad. He sighed, patted her shoulder and said, "Wei Shizi is stronger than Gu Chusheng, you will know it when you see it. Only after getting along, don't resist, daddy won't hurt you." "I know." Chu Yu nodded, this time with sincerity. She also wants to develop a relationship with Wei Jun, but she probably has no chance. Chu Yu thought of the fate of the Wei family, and felt a bit regretful. Seeing that Chu Yu was not in a good mood, Chu Jiancheng waved his hand and asked Xia Yun and Chu Jin to support her back. Xia Yun was saying some words of dissuasion all the way, probably to let her die for Gu Chusheng. Chu Yu didn't speak, just listened quietly. Although this mother also did some absurd things later and favored Chu Jin, but she was also sincere to her. It's just the flesh on the back of the palm of the hand, which is always thick and thin. She was silent, and Chu Jin helped her to the bedroom. After the servants took care of her and groomed her, she lay down on the bed, ready to sleep. There are too many things happening in this day, she has to save her energy, and then plan how to go in the future. She always thought that her own way, as long as she followed Gu Chusheng. Now that she suddenly had a new choice, she was so overwhelmed. Within a moment of closing her eyes, she heard Chu Jin's voice. Chu Jin walked in with the medicine in hand, screened the next person, and then came to Chu Yu. She put down the medicine bowl, sat beside the bed, and said gently, "Sister." Chu Jin slowly opened his eyes and saw Chu Yu's worried expression. "Sister, are you okay?" That look didn't seem fake. Chu Yu's mind flickered, and she couldn't help thinking, maybe 15-year-old Chu Jin still has a bit of warmth towards her sister. Seeing that Chu Yu didn't answer, Chu Jin approached her and whispered, "Sister, Brother Gu has someone bring a message and say that he is waiting for you." Hearing this, Chu Yu raised her head suddenly, looking at Chu Jin in disbelief. Gu Chusheng waiting for her? Not possible. Gu Chusheng didn't care about her at all. After receiving the letter, he even left Huajing half a day earlier and left Huajing quickly. How could he wait for her? What went wrong? She stared at Chu Jin, and after thinking for a while, she understood. It is impossible for Gu Chusheng to say such a thing, and Chu Jin wants her to leave, so as to free up the position of the prince concubine of Zhenqiahefu for her, so she deliberately said such words to give Chu Yu hope, "Let Chu Yu leave quickly." She didn't say this in her last life, because Chu Yu in her last life didn't need Chu Jin to give her hope, so she chose to leave without looking back. But in this life, she made it clear to Chu Jianchong that she wanted to marry to the Wei mansion. Chu Yu wanted to laugh, this little sister of hers really always put her own interests first. However, she held back the smile on her lips, raised her face, frowned and said, "If that's the case, don't tell me any more." "Sister." Chu Jin was a little surprised, a trace of panic flashed in his eyes. Chu Yu said calmly, "I want to understand, my marriage to the Marquis of Zhenqiu was bestowed by the sage, and if I run away from the marriage, even if the Wei family doesn't say anything for the sake of the Chu family's face, the sage won't say it, but after all, this is deceiving the monarch. Bend the law, and the Wei family will also hold grudges in their hearts." The fall of the Chu family was not unrelated to this. Although the Wei family was killed in the battle soon after, they left behind a killing Wei Yun. The boy was 14 years old, and he was on the battlefield. At 16, he killed Bai Di to avenge his father and brother. The subsequent imperial court was almost ruled by Wen, Gu, and Wu Wei. Wei Yun was a man who would retaliate, with clear grievances and grievances. Those who were good to him back then would repay him, and those who were bad to him would not spare the slightest. Li Daidozong of the Chu family asked Chu Jin to marry Wei Jun. Chu Jin fell into the well and left Wei's house, and when he left, he had a nasty relationship with the old lady Wei, and the old man became seriously ill. These things Wei Yun they all remembered them one by one, and they all took revenge on Chu Jianchong after they were on the rise. If it wasn't for Gu Chusheng taking care of the Chu family, how could Chu Jianchong be able to return home safely? Thinking of Wei Yun's methods, Chu Jin couldn't help being a little timid. She pressed her right hand with her left hand, raised her eyes to look at Chu Jin, and said with worry, "Sister, we can't ignore our family for our own happiness." Chu Jin was stumped by Chu Yu's words, and after holding it for a long time, he forced a smile and said, "Sister is right." Ajin feels distressed that her sister's happiness is exchanged for her family. If she can suffer for her sister, Ajin feels that it would be better. Go to the Wei family to suffer? Who doesn't know that the Wei family is now being favored, and it is in full swing? Since the founding of the country, the Wei family has been loyal and fierce for generations. Even if Shiza Wei was not the best, he would never let Chu Jin suffer. For this marriage, the Chu family is still high. In order to convince her, Chu Jin can say anything. "Is my blessing, but I was blinded before, and now that I have woken up, don't say such things again. If you let me hear it again, don't blame me for turning your face." Chu Jin was speechless by Chu Yu's words. Looking at the upright face of the person in front of her, Chu Jin just wanted to remind her that she was still planning how to elope with her last night. However, she knew that this elder sister was strong in force and simple-minded, and she would not turn back if she believed it. So Chu Jin smiled hard and said, "Sister can think about it. I think my sister is already tired. Put the medicine here, Ajin should retire first." Chu Yu nodded, closed her eyes, and said nothing. Chu Jin respectfully withdrew, walked into the courtyard, and looked cold. She squeezed her palm. Now that Chu Yu refuses to elope, does she really want to marry Gu Chesheng? No, she must not marry Gu Chesheng. If she can't be the concubine, she must not follow Gu Chesheng to the border. Returning to Huajing from the border, and being promoted from Zhepin County Magistrate, her most beautiful years are afraid that she will be buried in the cold wind in the north. Chu Jin secretly calculated. At this time, Gu Chesheng was in the carriage at the city gate, quietly reading the latest newspaper. He contracted the cold and coughed softly while watching. He seems to be waiting for someone quietly, not in a hurry. The officers and soldiers next to me said impatiently, "Young Master Gu, it's time to go." Gu Chesheng looked up at the city gate and gave the servant a look. "Wait until sunset at the latest," the officers and soldiers frowned, "it can't be delayed any longer." Hearing this, Gu Chesheng frowned. Sunset. He recalled the time when Chu Yu caught up in his previous life, he should be able to wait. Thinking of the name, he closed his eyes in pain. Outsiders think that he is not afraid of everything in the family, but he is not. When he faced all this when he was a boy, he was really anxious and gave up on himself. It was the girl who came on a horse, raised the curtain of his car with a sword in the night rain, and said aloud, "Don't be afraid, I'll see you off." It gave him all the courage. When he was young, he didn't know his hazy heart. He just thought he hated her sweaty smell, didn't like her ignorance, and hated her chatting and laughing with the barracks sergeant. She chased, he ducked. He always thought that in his heart, there should be a pure and flawless girl like Chu Jin. Until she died before him. Recalling that moment, Gu Chesheng felt that his heart was suddenly pinched. He closed his eyes and calmed the pain with slow breathing. Chu Yu's death was the beginning of his love for her. After death, I know how hard it is to live with no one else. Only then did he realize that his disgust back then was actually jealousy, fear of unknown feelings, and a young man's counterattack against shyness. The longer and longer she died, the more persistent and deeper his feelings for her. It wasn't until he died under Wei Yun's sword that he felt relieved. When he woke up, he returned to his 17 years old, and he was ecstatic. Good. He opened his eyes and raised his eyebrows. He could see the living Chu Yu again. This time, he will definitely accompany her. Gu Chesheng didn't see Chu Yu until sunset. The inconsistency with the memory made him a little worried. At this time, the officers and soldiers lost their patience and forcibly pulled the carriage, dissatisfied. "Let's go." Gu Chesheng looked at the city gate where people came and went, took a deep breath, and finally set off. "It's okay, Chu Yu will definitely come." He told himself that his return would inevitably cause all changes, but he knew how deeply 17-year-old Chu Yu had feelings for him. She came in her last life, and she will come again in this life. When Gu Chesheng embarked on his official road full of hope, Chu Yu was sleeping beautifully. When she woke up, she received a message sent by Chu Jin, saying that Gu Chesheng had left Beijing. Chu Yu is not very concerned about whether Gu Chesheng leaves the capital or not. What she cares more about is, why is her sister so powerful? She doesn't know anything about the outside news now, but Chu Jin even knows when Gu Chesheng leaves the capital. These things should be the news that Chu Jin got from Gu Chesheng, that is to say, in fact, in those years, the relationship between Gu Chesheng and Chu Jin has never been broken. When Chu Jin said that he had no affection for Gu Chesheng and let her elope with Gu Chesheng, Chu Jin himself kept in touch with Gu Chesheng. Chu Yu raised her hand and threw the note in her hand into the stove, and the maid who came to deliver the letter said, "Second Miss Tong, you don't need to tell me about this kind of thing, I don't need to say too much about the rules. More, she knows it clearly." Speaking, Chu Yu raised her head, looked at the maid, and said coldly, "The general's mansion wants a face, let her weigh it herself." This note made her almost completely give up on her sister. Chu Jin's toughest and three-dimensional temperament was not cultivated in the future, but was broken in his bones and roots. She liked Gu Chesheng back then, but because she was Chu Jin's fiancée, she never showed it for so many years. She didn't say a word, and even avoided getting along with each other in daily life. She agreed to marry him when the saint gave her a marriage. She believed that she had done an excellent job. Even when she chased Gu Chusheng to Kunyang, Gu Chusheng himself was stunned. If it wasn't for Chu Jin crying, if it wasn't for Chu Jin begging her, how could she wait for Gu Chusheng? On the one hand, she said that she did not like to encourage her sister to seek true love, on the other hand, she was disconnected from Gu Chusheng. Chu Yu thought about it for a while, and didn't want to think about it anymore. Taking advantage of the fact that she had just returned, she found a pen and ink and began to recall all the important events she remembered in her previous life. Since she came back, she naturally couldn't come back in vain. In the short term, the biggest thing is that the Wei family died in the battlefield. On July 27 of that year, that is, the day that Chu Jin married Wei Jun, a border emergency report was sent to Huajing, and Wei Jun went on an expedition with his father. The Wei family has a total of 7 children, including the youngest Wei Qilang, Wei Yun, who all followed to the battlefield. Everyone thought that the Wei family, the of war, would return triumphantly soon as before, but a month later, the news came that 200,000 elite soldiers had been wiped out in Beatty Valley under the leadership of the Wei family. Wei Yun helped the coffin back to Beijing and was tried at Dali Temple, because the reason for the failure of the battle was that Wei Ishong, the Marquis of Zhenqiu, forcibly pursued the deserters from Baidi despite the imperial order. As a result, the major families have expressed their separation from the Wei family. Except for the second son, Wei Shu's wife, Zhang Shi, who committed suicide, all the other wives and concubines asked to leave. Wei Yun wrote a letter of reconciliation for these people on behalf of his elder brother's father. In a short time, the Wei family tree fell apart, leaving only one Wei Yun and the old lady Wei, with 5 children who had not yet grown up. Chu Yu and Gu Chusheng were far away in Kunyang at that time. Kunyang is the second line in the northern border and is an important place for food and grass transportation. At that time, Chu Yu helped Gu Chusheng to transport food and grass to the front line many times. However, when Chu Yu came into contact with the war, it was already after the Wei family had died. She did not know exactly how and why the Wei family died back then. She only knew that Yao Yang, the uncle of the state, was ordered to guard Beicheng and finally abandoned the city and fled. There were wars all over the place, and they were restrained. When there was no one available in the DPRK, Wei Yun pleaded for his life in prison and went to the front line in a life-and-death situation. Win or die. She doesn't want the Wei family to die. Chu Yu held the pen with a cold light in her eyes. Those iron-blooded men in the Wei family should not die. She wrote down all the relevant fragments of the Wei family, trying to restore the events of the past. Writing until it was close to dawn, Xia Yun walked in with someone carrying a plate. If you don't have a good rest, I'll see how you fare tomorrow. Mother, it's okay. Chu Yu threw the papers into the charcoal stove and combed them all night. All the details were scrutinized in her mind, and it was extremely clear. Chu Yu turned around calmly, saw what the maid prepared, and said with a smile, "Is it a wedding dress?" "Yeah, hurry up and change it." Xia Yun was a little dissatisfied, but seeing her daughter's happy appearance, those dissatisfactions were also diluted a lot, and she invited people in and waited on Chu Yu started to wash up. Bathing, changing clothes, rubbing osmanthus head oil, and putting on a red gold embroidered phoenix robe. Then Chu Yu sat upright in front of the scriptures, and the maid came forward to do her makeup. Chu Jin came in with a comb, walked to Xia Yun, and said to Xia Yun, "Mother, let's comb your hair." Xia Yun looked at Chu Yu in the mirror, and said in a hoarse voice to Chu Jin, "Look at her, she doesn't dress up on weekdays, it's the first time she looks so good looking today, I'm going to see her husband." Speaking, Xia Yun picked up the comb, raised her hand and inserted the comb into her hair, and said in a low voice, "If you go to Wei's house in the future, don't act as willful as you would at home, and get married." After all, your daughter will suffer more, you are in the Wei family, you can endure everything you can, and don't argue too much. If it were the past, listening to these words, Chu Yu would probably argue with Xia Yun. However, listening to Xia Yun's crying voice now, her disputing heart dissipated. She sighed and just said, "My daughter knows." Xia Yun nodded and raised her hand to comb Chu Yu's hair. "Comb the white hair." 2 combs of white hair and eyebrows. Xia Yun was combing Chu Yu's hair while holding back tears. At the end, she couldn't hold back, as if she was tired, and was supported by Chu Jin and walked aside. The maid came forward to give Chu Yu a haircut, and then put on the phoenix crown. While doing this, the sky gradually brightened, and the sound of gongs and drums was heard outside. A maid rushed in a hurry and said happily, "Madam, Miss, the Wei family is here." Hearing this, Xia Yun stood up and seemed to want to go out, but as soon as she stepped out, she suddenly thought, "It can't be done, they still have a while." So he came back and stayed in the house with the female family members, waiting for the arrival of the Wei family. According to the custom, the Wei family will come to greet the relatives, and the Chu family will set up some things to make things difficult for Chu Yu to go out until the hour. So it was very lively outside, and Chu Yu and the others waited in the room, and their hearts couldn't help itching. Chu Jin is still a teenager after all, listening to the sound outside, whispered, "Mother, why don't I go out and take a look?" When these words came out, everyone was thinking, everyone looked at Xia Yun. Xia Yun couldn't help laughing, "You guys who can't hold back, just welcome relatives, what's so good about this?" Nice. Chu Yu thought about it. Gu Chusheng once said that he would hold a grand wedding for her, but she waited all her life. Something that I have been waiting for all my life is always a little different. Chu Yu suppressed the curiosity in her heart and said with Xia Yun, "Mother, let's go out and have a look." "You kid." Xia Yun pushed her with a smile, and while she was talking, she heard the arguing, and then she saw 2 teenagers fighting on the roof. Chu Jin exclaimed, "It's the second brother." The Chu family has a total of 4 children, the first son Chu Liniang, the second son Chu Lingxi, and the rest are the 2 sisters Chu Yu and Chu Jin. The Chu family was from a general family, and Chu Liniang was still a little scruples because of his identity, while Chu Lingxi didn't show courtesy to the Wei family for a long time. The female relatives flocked to the window and scrambled to look out to see the people on the eaves. Chu Yu, Xia Yun, and Chu Jin walked to the door together and looked up. Chu Liniang looked quite handsome in a blue robe. The young man opposite him looked to be in his early 14th year, dressed in a black suit, and his hair was tied with a black and white headband. Although he was neatly dressed, the arrogance that he exuded from the inside out was no less than that. Chu Liniang. Chu Liniang was already good-looking, but the person opposite was even more handsome. Eyes like stars and moon, eyebrows like mountains, Danfan's eyes are slightly upward at the corners of his eyes, with a bit of indescribable romantic beauty. However, the young man's expression was solemn and serious, and he only had the aura as sharp as a knife, which was directly pressing into the hearts of the people. Chu Yu's eyes were fixed on the boy, and for a moment, she seemed to have returned to her previous life, the first and only time she had seen this person so close. At that time, he was already the king of Zhenbei, and the governor of the 5 armies. Holding the military power, the power dominates the government and the opposition. The day she was sent away from Huajing by Gu Chusheng, it was windy and snowy. At that time, he was much tougher than he is now, and he is not like this now, with the childishness and vigor of a young man in his eyes. His eyes were as cold as a deep pool of ice, and he rode a horse to stop her carriage. "Mrs. Gu." His tone did not fluctuate. Although he asked, he did not have the slightest doubt. He already knew who the person in the curtain was. Chu Yu let people roll the curtains, sat in the carriage, saluted respectfully, and calmly replied, "Master Wei. Where is Madame Gu going?" "Dry Yang. When will you be back?" I don't know. Mrs. Gu, Wei Yun chuckled, do you regret it? Chu Yu was stunned for a moment. Wei Yun looked into the distance. Mrs. Gu knows that before the Wei mansion came to ask for a kiss, the family members came to ask, which of the two daughters in the Chu family, the elder brother admired. My brother said that he likes the eldest lady, because the eldest lady is practicing martial arts, and when I become an adult in the future, if he is not matched, he can bring his wife to battle. Speaking, he turned his head to look at her. Mrs. Gu is different from Ling Mei, who makes her more flamboyant, and she is a generation of flies and dogs. However, Mrs. Gu is willing to give up the royal marriage and go with Lord Gu. In the north, fighting on the battlefield. It's a pity that Madame Gu has no eyes. My brother treats Madame like jewels, but Madame doesn't care. The Madame has gone to this day. His eyes were calm. Do you regret it? At that time, Chu Yu chuckled lightly. She met the other person's eyes with a calm expression. When I do things, I never want to do it or not, and I don't want to regret it. The young man did not speak. He looked at her quietly for a long time, and said indifferently, it's a pity. She didn't answer. She just sat respectfully on her knees and watched the young man leave. Now she raised her head and watched Wei Yun and Chu Lingxi make a move. His skill was obviously much higher than Chu Lingxi, but he had been entangled with Chu Lingxi for a long time, so that there was no trace. The stone smashed on Chu Lingxi and smashed Chu Lingxi over on the spot. Chu Lingxi howled, Wei Qilang, you smack me. Wei Yun stood on the roof for a moment, then reacted and looked in the direction of Chu Yu. I saw a woman dressed in a wedding dress, wearing a phoenix crown, leaning against the door, holding a stone in her hand, throwing it up and down, smiling so seriously. Wei Yun immediately understood what was going on and smiled brightly. He bowed his hands towards Chu Yu, then jumped down. Chu Lingxi was making trouble with the other brothers of the Wei family. Chu Liniang was reconciling. Wei Yun quickly went around behind Wei Jun and whispered. He said, brother, sister-in-law is so pretty. Wei Jun was wearing a wedding robe, with his hands behind his back, pretending to be calm, leaning on Wei Yun's side without a trace, and whispered, have you met? Chu Lingxi was beaten down by his sister-in-law. Wei Yun said this, quite sad, brother, I think I may really not be able to win the two of you in the future. Wei Jun frowned and smiled, that's natural, can your brother's vision be wrong? While speaking, when the time came, Chu Jianchong no longer delayed, raised his hand, and Chu Liniang hurriedly greeted Chu Lingxi and the other Wei family members to stand on both sides. In the inner courtyard, the maid rushed in a panic, began to cover Chu Yu's head, and helped Chu Yu to walk out. Wei Jun stood in front. Wei Yun and the second son Wei Shu stood behind Wei Jun, and the rest stood in several rows behind the three. The Chu family stood on the steps. Politely the official stood in the first place on the right and sang and said, open the door to welcome the relatives. The door slowly opened, and Chu Yu appeared in front of everyone, dressed in a happy robe and supported by Chu Jin. Her eyes were flushed red, and she could not see anything, only the sound of happy firecrackers exploded in her ears, and then a red silk cloth was placed in front of her. She heard a gentle and elegant middle banded with a nervous voice that could not be concealed. He said, Chu, Chu, Miss Chu. Chu Yu chuckled lightly. She held the red silk and spoke softly. Master Wei, don't be nervous. She said, I'll follow you. Wei Jun's heart suddenly calmed down. He held the red silk, and his uneasy heart finally let go. He made no mistake. The author has something to say. Wei Yun was still a child at this time, so he won't be too brilliant, but when he grows up, it will be unmatched by anyone. Don't worry. The calm mood of the people in front of her made Chu Yu very relieved. She didn't see the appearance of her future husband, but judging from the hand he handed over, it probably wouldn't be too bad. Chu Yu has never had such an experience. In the past 30 years, she has been a sturdy female man in everyone's heart, and she does not need pity or love. Gu Chusheng has always treated her with respect, and more, even the boss has a cold attitude towards his subordinates. Chu Yu sat in the sedan chair, secretly lifted the curtain, and wanted to see Wei Jun in front. However, Wei Jun rode his horse and walked in front. Instead, he saw Wei Yun who was standing beside him. Wei Yun noticed Chu Yu's movements and curled his lips toward her, his eyes full of eyes. It was a clear smile, as if she had grabbed her handle. Chu Yu seemed to have been read through her mind or by a child. She couldn't help feeling a little embarrassed. She quickly put down her hijab and sedan chair, and sat back obediently. After sitting in the sedan chair, Chu Yu began to plan. In the last life, the border news arrived in Huajing on this day, but Chu Yu didn't know exactly when it was. The border is in danger now, and the Wei family is the most suitable candidate for the expedition. It is difficult for her to find a reason to prevent the Wei family from going out. Wei Jun can try to stay in the name of the newlyweds, but the others really have no reason. The only way is to prevent them from being defeated. I heard that it was because Wei Zhong was chasing the remaining soldiers, but he was caught in a trap. This time, if the Wei family defended the city well, there should be no such disaster. Chu Yu pondered, listening to the whistling outside for a long time. The sedan chair finally stopped. After a while, she heard the car door being kicked open, and in the midst of laughter, the red silk was handed over again. This time Wei Jun didn't stutter and said with a smile, "Miss Chu, I'll take you in." Chu Yu held the red silk, looked at her feet, and was pulled forward by Wei Jun. She walked steadily. Wei Jun reminded me carefully, surrounded by the whispering voices of the Wei family's children. Although it was small, it was enough for her to hear. Many of them are half-year-old children, and said with vigor, "I heard that my sister-in-law is beautiful." Xiao Qi said, "Very beautiful. Can you be more beautiful than that first beauty, Chu Jin?" Xiao Qi has high eyesight and is definitely prettier than Chu Jin. Chu Yu couldn't help but smile when she heard the frank words of the Wei family. Wei Jun also heard it, and was a little embarrassed. He knew that Chu Yu practiced martial arts, and thought that Chu Yu must have heard it. So he helped Chu Yu across the gap between the brazier, and he whispered beside her, "Don't be angry, I'll clean them up later." When Chu Yu heard this, she couldn't help but laughed and said, "It's okay, I like them like this." Wei Jun heard Chu Yu's voice. Although he had not seen Chu Yu's appearance, he also thought, such a girl must be very beautiful. He had some expectations in his heart, and took Chu Yu to the lobby. The two worshipped the heaven and the earth according to the harmony of the ritual officer. This journey has been very smooth. Chu Yu is happy, and has a little more expectation for the life of the Wei family. She was very calm, a kind of calm and relaxed joy that spread when she finally straightened up. She didn't marry Gu Chusheng, and everything will not start all over again. She stood in front of Wei Jun and wanted to lift her hijab to take a look at the man in front of her. She felt that Wei Jun should be half a head taller than her, and intuitively felt that Wei Jun should be a slightly weaker man. Chu Yu stood still, when someone next to her came to help her to go back to the room. Wei Shu came forward and coaxed, "Brother, go and lift your hijab, stop drinking." "That's right," the other sons shouted, "Brother, go lift your hijab. We don't want you to drink. Go, go." Wei Jun blushed and said with them, "Follow the rules and go." Speaking, he was a little worried that Chu Yu was unhappy, turned his head, and whispered, "Miss Chu, you go and wait for a while. Is the prince coming soon?" Chu Yu whispered, the voice was soft and crisp. Wei Jun's heart softened, and whispered, "Well, it won't be long." "The prince promised me," Chu Yu said with a bit of solemnity, "no matter what happens, you must come back as soon as possible." Speaking, Chu Yu felt that these words were a bit abrupt, so she whispered, "The concubine is waiting for the prince to come back and pick a hijab." Wei Jun had some doubts at the beginning, but then he understood that Chu Yu probably didn't like this hijab. He whispered, "If you don't like this hijab, you can take it off and wait for me when no one else is there. The Wei family doesn't have so many rules." After speaking, Wei Jun was worried that Chu Yu thought he was going to stay outside, so he added, "I will be back as soon as possible." Chu Yu nodded and was supported by others back to the room. Wei Jun turned around and began to greet the guests. After Chu Yu returned to her room, she sat down beside the bed. She really doesn't like this hijab, but she likes the Wei family, and when Wei Jun takes her heart, she is willing to repay Wei Jun with the best she can. Sitting on the bed, she was a little bored and began to fantasize. She is not a vengeful person, since what happened in her previous life did not happen in this life, she did not want to worry about it. Gu Chusheng has left Huajing, and she has also married into the Wei family. Now, the past with Gu Chusheng and Chu Jin is not the most important thing. The most important thing is to look forward. From today's point of view, the Wei family is as easy to get along with as in the legend. She should not be too sad in the Wei family in the future. After a while, when Wei Jun came back, she tried to see if she could let Wei Jun stay in the name of the newlyweds. Even if she couldn't, she would try to follow Wei Jun to the front line. There should be nothing wrong. As long as the Wei family wins this, she and Wei Jun can live a good life in the future. She knows the changes of the dynasty in the next 12 years, and she can defend her family in an invincible position. The Wei family is good, and Wei Yun probably won't become the of killing in the future. When she saw this young man today, she was still a child as happy as a bird. She should also grow into a gentle general on his brother's side, right? Chu Yu pondered, her thoughts were a little far away. After waiting for a long time, the maid next to her saw that she was motionless, and came up to ask, "Does the young lady need some cakes?" "No need," Chu Yu said warmly, and at this moment, the sound of war horses neighing and hurried footsteps could be heard in the distance. Chu Yu's heart tightened, she abruptly lifted her hijab and walked outside. The maid was shocked by her, stepped forward to stop her, and said anxiously, "Young madam, where are you going?" Chu Yu didn't dare to act too strange, after all, she was afraid that she would be burned as a demon. She suppressed her anxiety and frowned, "I heard the sound of war horses outside, I'm afraid something happened, I want to go and see." "You don't have to worry about the young lady," the maid smiled, "the prince will take care of everything, and the young lady can just wait here." "I'm worried." Chu Yu pushed the maid away, walked out, and said with a cold face, "I must go and see." The maid was pushed aside by Chu Yu. Chu Yu opened the door and hurried out. She didn't know the structure of the Wei family, so she could only walk in the direction of the noise. At this time, the footsteps outside became more and more rapid, and there were more and more people. The maid chased Chu Yu, her face was full of anxiety. She tried to pull Chu Yu and said, "Young madam! Young madam, you haven't lifted the hood, you." Before he finished speaking, there were rapid footsteps outside, and then Wei Yun appeared from the corner. He was wearing armor and still had a childish look on his face. Chu Yu stopped and clenched her fists. Wei Yun looked at the woman wearing a phoenix crown in front of him, met her clear eyes, knelt down on one knee decisively, gave a military salute to Chu Yu, put the jade pendant in both hands, and said calmly, "Report urgently from the front, sir." The general was ordered to go out, and at the end of the order, the general will hand over this jade to the young lady, and instruct the lady that she will return triumphantly, so there is no need to worry. Hearing this, Chu Yu saw the jade pendant that Wei Yun was holding. She raised her hand to hold the jade pendant, raised her eyes and looked outside. "Where is Wei Jun?" "The major general has departed." Wei Yun's voice was a little quieter, and he seemed to know how hard it was for the woman to go out on the wedding day. He thought about it, and was about to comfort him when he saw Chu Yu rushing out. She ran very fast, her happy clothes flying in the wind. Wei Yun was stunned for a while, then reacted and rushed out after chasing Chu Yu, saying anxiously, "Sister-in-law." Chu Yu didn't speak, she ran all the way to the gate, raised her hand and grabbed a soldier and threw it down, grabbed the horse and rushed out. The Wei family was stunned, until Wei Yun chased after him and followed Chu Yu's way, grabbed the horse and chased him out, and then they reacted. "Is that the princess? The young lady?" While everyone was surprised, Chu Yu was extraordinarily calm. The September cold wind brought chills, and her horse beat so fast that it hurt like a knife in the face. Wei Yun followed closely behind him. He had no idea that this sister-in-law's riding skills were so superb. He said with difficulty, "Sister-in-law, stop chasing, it's useless to catch up. My brother will come back, don't worry." Chu Yu didn't say anything. She knew the route out of the city, from Huajing to lead the troops out of the city to the north. It must be the north gate. She went all the way around the road, and when she saw the galloping team from the hill, she swooped down from the hillside with her horse in between. Wei Yun was so frightened that he was heartbroken, wondering how he would explain to his father and brother if something happened to this sister-in-law here. He gritted his teeth and followed Chu Yu to rush, and saw Chu Yu rushing directly to the official road, one person and one horse, forcing a team to stop. The Wei family was stunned when they saw the woman in red who suddenly appeared, and then saw Wei Yun who followed. Wei Zhong stepped forward and couldn't believe it. "Xiao Qi, this is father-in-law." Chu Yu gave Wei Zhong a military salute and respectfully said, "Daughter-in-law is rude." After hearing this, the faces of the Wei family army were colorful. Looking at this man's wedding dress and Wei Yun, he had a guess, but it was really Chu Yu who came. Wei Jun was stunned behind Wei Zhong. Then she saw Chu Yu set her eyes on him. The autumn rain was fine and dense, Chu Yu was holding the reins, and the big red wide-sleeved wedding dress was stained with rain and dust. She raised her head slightly, raised her voice, and said aloud, "Where is my husband Wei Hun?" Wei Jiajun bowed their heads, not daring to look up. Only Wei Jun bit the bullet and rode out of the line, saying with difficulty, I am here. The author has something to say." When Wei Jun came out, everyone was a little embarrassed. It's not a decent thing to be chased out by his wife and put on anyone. Chu Yu looked at Wei Jun. The young man in front of her was beautiful and gentle, just as she imagined, more like a scholar than a military general. He was born ordinary, not as handsome as Wei Yun's shocking Dechuan in the future, but Chu Yu felt particularly fond of him. She looked at him quietly, held the reins and said, "Husband, remember what you promised me." Wei Jun didn't say anything. Chu Yu got married and came to Wei Jun, raised her hand and put down the hijab, leaning forward slightly. "The prince promised me that he would come back and lift his hijab." The people around who heard this were stunned. Wei Jun's fingers trembled slightly. He looked at the fiery woman in front of him, and his heart seemed to be hit hard. He raised his hand and carefully lifted Chu Yu's hijab little by little. Chu Yu lowered her eyes, and when the light re-entered her line of sight, she looked up at him. Bright eyes gave birth to spring water. She smiled brightly. "Husband," she said softly, "the whole life of a concubine will be tied to the husband." Wei Jun didn't speak, his heart beat a little faster. Chu Yu sat up straight and said calmly, "My concubine is willing to go out with her husband." "No." Wei Zhong was the first to speak. "My Wei family has no reason to let women go to the battlefield. There is no shortage of wives in the Wei family, but it is true that I have never heard of anyone who followed his husband to the battlefield." "Chu Yu still wants to fight again? Father-in-law, I have studied martial arts since I was a child, and I used to go on expeditions with my father. That's the Chu family." Wei Zhong frowned, thought about it, and let out a soft breath. "Ayu, I understand how you want to protect Junior, but the man has men's battlefield, women also have women's inner houses. If you really think about Junior, go back and help your mother-in-law take care of the clutter at home, and quietly wait for Junior to come back." Wei Zhong is a very macho man, and Chu Yu has long heard of this. She glanced at the expressions of the surrounding soldiers. Even Wei Jun expressed disapproval. She was prepared for this result, and now she is just trying it out. So she took a deep breath and looked up at Wei Jun. "Okay, I'll wait for my husband to return. Don't worry." Wei Jun was moved, and he couldn't help being a little hoarse when he spoke. He knew how dangerous the battlefield was. He lowered his head and said, "I will definitely come back safely." "Okay," Chu Yu nodded and looked at him seriously, "then remember, I'm waiting for you at home, you must protect yourself, this battle is mainly about defense, and the poor do not chase." Wei Jun was stunned for a while, a little confused. Chu Yu stared at him and said again, "Promise me, no matter what this time, the Wei family army will never pursue the remaining soldiers." "Father wouldn't do such a rash thing." Wei Jun came back to his senses and smiled, "You don't have to worry about it." "You swear?" Chu Yu grabbed his sleeve, forced him, and whispered, "If your father chases down the remaining soldiers in this battle, you must stop them." Wei Jun was a little helpless, thinking that Chu Yu was overly worried, raised his hand and said, "Okay, I swear, I will never let my father chase the remaining soldiers." Hearing this, Chu Yu felt relieved. She loosened Wei Jun's sleeve, and said with a smile, "Okay, I'll wait for you to come back." After saying that, Chu Yu resolutely gave way and said with Wei Zhong, "Master Ho, you are disturbing." Wei Zhong's expression was soft, and he was very satisfied to see his son marry such a wife who treated him wholeheartedly. He nodded and said with Wei Yun, "Xiao Qi, send your sister-in-law back." After he finished speaking, he started again without waiting for Wei Yun to respond. Wei Yun accompanied her to watch the Wei family army leave, and after walking away, he said, "Sister-in-law, come back." This time, there was no normal playfulness in his words, but a little more respect. Chu Yu looked back at him and saw the young man's eyes were clear and soft. She said calmly, "Go after it, I don't need you to send it." "Sister-in-law, you go back and forth, it wastes too much time to chase after them, and you will also consume physical strength when you are on the front line. Don't waste your physical strength on this." Wei Yun hesitated. Chu Yu looked in the direction Wei Jun left. She did everything she could. Wei Jun promised her that she would not pursue the remnants, there should be nothing left. She turned her head to look at Wei Yun. Wei Yun was alive back then, there must be his way. She looked at him and said seriously, "Wei Yun, promise me one thing." Sister-in-law ordered. Seeing Chu Yu's expectant gaze, Wei Yun spoke subconsciously, but didn't even ask anything. Chu Yu's words contained some requests: "Take good care of your brother, you must go home well. If there is an accident, at least, don't just leave this 14-year-old boy to come back and endure the storms in the future alone." Hearing this, Wei Yun was stunned for a while, then laughed. "Don't worry, sister-in-law," he said with pride, "don't look at the elder brother who looks like a scholar, but he is actually very strong." "What else did Chu Yu say?" Wei Yun hurriedly said, "But I will definitely protect the big brother, protect him on the battlefield, if he wants to lose a hair, I will raise my head." "See." Wei Yun patted his chest and made a ticket, obviously very confident in his brother. Chu Yu wanted to laugh, but she was still worried. She thought about it for a while, and finally said, "Go." "But remember," she said coldly, "this time, the Wei family must focus on defending the city, and the poor bandits should not pursue it." Wei Yun nodded ignorantly, and took a few steps on the horse. He couldn't help but stop and looked back at Chu Yu. "Sister-in-law, why do you repeatedly emphasize this point?" Wei Yun is sharp. Wei Jun thinks that Chu Yu is too worried, but Wei Yun's intuition is not. Chu Yu is not good at lying. After a moment of silence, she slowly said, "I had a nightmare. In the dream, you chased the remnants of the army, you were defeated in Beatty Valley, and the Wei family was full, only you came back." Hearing this, Wei Yun instantly turned cold. It was a big ominous thing to say this before the expedition. He wanted to be angry, but the woman's expression stopped him. Her expression was full of sadness, as if this had really happened. So he blocked those rebuttals between his lips and teeth, and said in a stiff voice, "Dreams are all opposites, don't think blindly." After saying that, he turned around and went after his father and brother. He turned around by chance, and saw that the plain was paved all the way to the horizon. The tall city stood behind the woman, the sky and the earth were yellow with the unique autumn color. The woman was riding a horse in red, independent of the old colored on the withered field. She seems to be saying goodbye and waiting. The thin face is well defined, and the slender eyes are calm and calm. After Chu Yu sent the last member of the Wei family to leave, he rode back to the Wei residence. After returning to the Wei mansion, the housekeeper saw her return and said anxiously, "Young madam, you are back. Madam asked you to come over." "I'm sorry." Chu Yu nodded, got off the horse, and said to the housekeeper, "Please tell your wife, I'll go right over." The housekeeper was dissatisfied with Chu Yu and had never seen such an outrageous bride, but Chu Yu apologized sincerely, and he felt a lot more comfortable, and respectfully said, "Young madam, don't worry, you first go wash up." Speaking, the housekeeper arranged for someone to lead Chu Yu back to the bedroom. After Chu Yu got acquainted briefly, she put on a long aqua blue dress and followed the servants to Mrs. Wei's room. Mrs. Wei, whose real name is Lu Suiyang, is Wei Zhong's wife and the biological mother of Wei Jun and Wei Yun. There are 7 children in the Wei family, 2 descendants, the first son Wei Jun and the old 7th Wei Yun. The remaining 5, the 2nd Wei Shu and the 5th Wei Ya are from the Liang family of the 2nd house, the 3rd Wei Qin, the 4th Wei Feng, and the 6th Wei Rong are all from the 3rd house Wang. Lu Suiyang was born in a family of poetry and calligraphy. And Wei Zhong's mother, the old lady Qin, doesn't care about the little things, but only the big ones. So the feed in the home fell into the hands of the 2nd house Liang. Before marrying into the Wei family, Xia Yun once explained the affairs of the Wei family well, and when it comes to Lu Suiyang, she just said, "This lady has a weak temper and soft ears, and has never lost any temper, you don't worry too much about it. Instead, it's Mr. Liang who is in charge and needs to please brides to please their mother-in-law, this is the way to survive in the backyard." Xia Yun has been working here all her life, and teaching Chu Yu like this is not wrong. It's just that Chu Yu grew up by Chu Jianchang's side since childhood, so she didn't like Xia Yun's set much. Lu Suiyang is her mother-in-law and the eldest lady of the Wei family. How she respects the Liang family can only be better than Lu Suiyang. What's more, who said Lu Suiyang was soft? After Wei Yun was imprisoned, when the soldiers seized the Wei mansion, they humiliated the daughters of the Wei family. Even the most virtuous Wei Shu's wife, Zhang Shi, just chose to commit suicide. Only the eldest lady, holding a sword, directly killed someone, and was accidentally killed by the soldiers under the blade, which alarmed the saint. Although it is a bit stupid to use her life to share, but she is a weak woman from a scholarly family, who can kill people with a sword, who can say that she is weak? Chu Yu had praise and admiration for Lu Suiyang. She tidied up her clothes and stood respectfully at Lu Suiyang's door, waiting for the servants to enter and report. After a while, the servant took Chu Yu into the room. Chu Yu did not look up. After she entered the door, she saluted the person on the couch meticulously, and respectfully said, "My daughter-in-law has seen Granny." A somewhat weak female voice came from above, "It seems to be abiding by the rules, why do you do such a bastard?" Chu Yu didn't speak, and Lu Suiyang was helped straight up. As soon as she moved, she coughed lightly, and the maid next to her was familiar with the door and handed her a handkerchief. "There are often wars. I know that you are wronged when you are newly married, but this is the life of a woman in my family. I protect the family and defend the country. If I can't fight in the battlefield to serve the country, I will live in the inner room and wait for my husband to return. You can't stop your husband from going to the front line for selfishness, do you understand?" After hearing this, Chu Yu understood. Lu Suiyang probably thought she was going to stop Wei Jun and prevent him from going to the battlefield. So Chu Yu replied, "Mother-in-law is right, and the daughter-in-law thinks the same way. The daughter-in-law has a little martial arts, so if she wants to go to the front line with the prince, she can also help 1 or 2. Hearing this, Lu Suiyang's face looked much better. She sighed, "I misunderstood you, it's hard for you to have this heart. But after all, the war is their man's business. As a woman, it is my duty to keep the inner house safe, and to spread the branches and leaves." As she spoke, she beckoned, and a woman about the same age as Lu Suiang came forward and held a box in front of Chu Yu. "Promise is the word of Wei Jun." Wei Jun is now 24 years old, but because of the marriage contract with the Chu family, she has been waiting for Chu Yu and Hu. Chu Yu stopped talking and said sincerely, "Mother-in-law, don't worry." Lu Suiang looked at Chu Yu. Chu Yu kept her eyes down for a long time, and after a while, she finally heard the person above, "Go and rest." Chu Yu responded and resigned respectfully. After she went out, she stood in the Wei family yard and breathed a sigh of relief. She took out the jade pendant in her hand and thought of Wei Jun. "This man is a good man." She thought this life will surely get better. The author has something to say. Wei Yun, hold on, don't climb the wall. Can't wait until I grow up. Chu Yu spent the night alone in the new house. When he woke up the next day, he ordered his servants to clean the house in an orderly manner, and then called Wei Jun's people over to get acquainted with them. The Wei family's family is strict and elegant, and there are many disciplines for their children. One of them is that they must not be contaminated with women before they get married. Therefore, in the Weihun room, except for a few newly sent maids to serve Chu Yu, the others are all boy. Every son of the Wei family must be accompanied by 3 attendants, one who is quite skilled in foreign affairs, one who manages internal affairs, and one who serves personally. The servant who was serving him personally followed Wei Jun to the northern battlefield, while the remaining housekeeper Wei Xia and bodyguard Wei Chuzhang were still in the mansion. She looked at Wei Jun's account and thought about it and said to Wei Chu, "Maybe I can contact people in the north now? I want to know the news on the battlefield as soon as possible." "You can rest assured, Mrs. Wei," Wei Chu said immediately. "The Wei family has a separate carrier pigeon, and will get news from the front as soon as possible." A separate communication channel for carrier pigeons. The Wei family is indeed a gatekeeper for generations. Chu Yu nodded and thought for a while, "Then can I write a letter to the prince?" "Nature." Wei Chu smiled and said, "What does the young lady want to write?" Chu Yu didn't think too much about it. He brought a pen and paper, wrote casually about trivial matters in life, and then asked about the war. All relationships are to be cultivated. Although Chu Yu is only admiring Wei Jun, she still intends to actively cultivate this relationship. After all, it is already a blessing, occupying the position of a wife. You should try hard with the other party. Chu Yu always felt that her greatest strength was probably her strong mentality. Although Gu Chusheng experienced 12 desperate years, she did not despair of everyone in the world because of this. She has always believed that there are always people in this world who deserve to be sincerely treated. After writing the letter and sending it out, in the afternoon, Chu Yu went to visit the people in each son's room one by one. The Wei family has 7 children, except for Wei Jun and Wei Yun, who are not married, and the other 5 have married and have children. Because she was born from a concubine, most of her wives are also daughters of concubines from high families. Chu Yu doesn't have much memory of the female relatives of the Wei family, and she also remembers that the second family, Zhang, committed suicide. Wei Yun was raised alone. Chu Yu specially went to see those children during the visit. These children are not very different in age. The eldest is the second son of Wei Shu, who is only 6 years old now, and the youngest is the 6th son. The child, who is only 2 years old, is still unsteady. These children play together in the yard on weekdays, and their relationship is not bad. Chu Yu learned about the habits of the children and the temperament of the young ladies in each room, and she almost has a feeling for the whole Wei family. And these young ladies of the Wei family do not care about anything. They either focus on their husbands like the Zhang family, or they put their minds on the clothes, jewelry, leaf cards, and the Wei family's great cause big, but no one has been wronged, so they are very harmonious. The only person in charge of the Wei family's inner house is the second wife Liang Shi, the one who took most of the Wei family's property and disappeared in the future. And NBSP, going very hard. Chu Yu had the battlefield in mind, and was worried about internal affairs, so she slept very lightly at night. On the second day, when it was time to return to the door, Chu Yu had no choice but to get up early, and went to Lu Suiang to pay homage. The man prepared the carriage and went out. Not too far away, a maid stopped Chu Yu and said hesitantly, "It seems that the young lady has never communicated with the second lady." After hearing this, Chu Yu glanced at the maid. This is the maid sent by the Wei family to serve her. Now that the Wei family is under the control of the Liang family, this maid should be a member of the Liang family. When she said this, she meant to beat her. Chu Yu smiled lightly, "What's your name? I recognized too many people yesterday, and I forgot about it for a while." The maid took a step back and said respectfully, "Slave Chunner." "Oh, Chunner." Chu Yu nodded, then said, "Then go and report to the second lady." Chunner saw Chu Yu's clothes soften, smiled, bowed, and left. After she left, Chu Yu turned her head and said to the attendant, "Let's go." The attendant was stunned, then hesitantly said, "Sister Chunner, is there any reason for me to wait for a maid? As a personal maid, the master has to go out but still has to wander around. Am I the master or she is the master?" Chu Yu's face was cold. "Go." Hearing this, the attendant instantly understood that Chunner was finished. How dare he get involved in this? Chunner was a first-class maid, he was just a groom who rode a horse, he didn't want to provoke him at all, so he hurriedly pretended not to know anything and rode away. She opened her eyes wide and asked the guard at the gate, "Where's the young lady?" "The young lady is gone, why are you still here?" Chu Yu was sitting on the carriage leisurely, thinking in her heart that this time she married in a hurry, and the dowry maids brought over were arranged by Xia Yun. The maids Chang Jiu and Wan Yu that she was used to are beautiful. Xia Yun worried that the two of them had unreasonable thoughts about Wei Jun, so she replaced them with two ordinary-looking ones. The two of them, Chu Yu, were not familiar with each other, and it was as if she had not brought them with them. Therefore, when she returned home this time, she not only planned to see the situation at home, but also planned to bring Chang Yu and Wan Yu back. The general's mansion and Wei's house are separated by half a city. Chu Yu traveled for half an hour before arriving at the Chu house. However, it was still in the morning. Finished breakfast. Because I didn't expect her to come so early, Chu Jianchang, Chu Liniang, and Chu Lingxi were all out and didn't have time to come back, only the female family was at home. Chu Yu was not in a hurry, Guining would always see her father and brother one day. She was led into the house by the maid. Xia Yun was already waiting for her with Chu Jin and two sisters-in-law. Sister-in-law Xia Chun is the direct daughter of the Xia family. Xia Yun has grown up, and she is a cousin to Chu Liniang. She is a rather quiet and gentle woman. Seeing Chu Yu coming, she didn't say too much. She sat in the first position beside Xia Yun, stood up with Xia Yun, and smiled at Chu Jin, but she couldn't find anything wrong. The second sister-in-law Yao Tao is the daughter of the Yao family, but she is very popular with the old lady of the Yao family. The Yao family came from a businessman's background, and he was not highly regarded by the aristocratic family because of his military exploits. But if today's son uses the Yao family as a sword to suppress the family, and even makes the Yao family's daughter the queen, the status of the Yao family is not the same. Yao Tao was just lively and smart when she got married, but after the Yao family became powerful, she became so arrogant, and she became more and more arrogant in the Chu family. She stood behind Xia Yun with Xia Chun, and when Chu Yu came in, Chu Yu stepped forward and saluted. Xia Yun quickly supported Chu Yu and said with red eyes, "It's been so long. Come back, is the Wei family detaining you?" "But the Wei family is difficult to get along with. I'm busy taking care of myself, how can you say that the Wei family is not easy to get along?" The husband went to the battlefield on the night of the wedding, which is not a good thing for any woman, but Yao Tao chose it specially. Chu Yu knew that Yao Tao was mocking her. She and Yao Tao had always been at odds. Yao Tao's concubine couldn't stand her daughter-in-law's style, and Chu Yu also looked down on Yao Tao. Yao Tao was outgoing and Chu Yu was upright. The two had already had a grudge before, and they spoke without concealment. After all, having lived an extra 12 years, Chu Yu can pretend to be much more than when she was young. However, in the face of a person like Yao Tao, she didn't want to pretend, but she was just about to say the piercing words. She suddenly remembered that she had such an undisclosed temperament in the past, which made Xia Yun always feel that she would not be bullied, so she protected Chu Jin in everything. So Chu Yu smiled, with a bit of sadness in her eyes, lowered her head, and said hoarsely, "Second sister-in-law, don't say that." Chu Yu's temperament, which has always been hot and hot, suddenly became like this. Xia Yun was very distressed, and felt that her daughter must be very sad. Yao Tao was stunned for a while, but she couldn't help but reflect, Chu Yu showed this expression, did she overdo it? Xia Yun's eyes turned red with anger, and yelled at Yao Tao, "Go back to your room. Did you talk to my sister-in-law like this?" Being so yelled at by Xia Yun, Yao Tao was stunned for a moment, and the reflection just now was thrown behind her mind. She snorted coldly, "What if I tell the truth? It's amazing to be on the high branch of the Wei family. So what if you climbed up, that is, being a widow, Yao Tao?" Xia Yun roared, "Go back to me. Don't be angry, mother." Chu Jin sighed and looked at Yao Tao, "Second sister-in-law, don't be angry with your mother, it's my sister who is more sensitive, and if you make mother anxious, don't you either excuse me, let's go back to rest first." Chu Jin said this, and took all the faults to Chu Yu, with a generous face. Yao Tao and Chu Jin have always been on good terms. Hearing Chu Jin's words, he felt a lot more relieved. He snorted coldly, and turned to leave. Chu Jin and Chu Yu were left in the room, and Chu Yu did not show her face. According to her past temperament, she had already slapped the case and asked Chu Jin why she's sensitive. However, without thinking about Chu Jin, she can only say that she just wants to appease Yao Tao and let her relax, don't be so narrow. In short, the high hats are all worn by Chu Yu, and the losses are all eaten by Chu Yu. The reason why Chu Jin dared to do this was only because she was sure that Xia Yun would favor her, and Chu Yu, as an elder sister, although she looked savage and unforgiving, was always a person who valued family affection. Chu Yu was like this back then, but now Chu Yu is different. She took a sip of tea in silence, and the atmosphere was quiet, because she did not continue to make trouble. When it was time for Xia Yun to react, she complained about Chu Jin, "Just now, it is the second daughter-in-law first. Who blamed you, why did you say it was your sister instead? This is just a stopgap measure. When my sister returns home, I can't keep making trouble like this forever." Chu Jin helped Xia Yun to sit down and poured tea for Xia Yun. The temperature was just right, which made Xia Yun feel a lot more comfortable. She turned her head and looked at the eldest daughter who had been silent. "Even if she is gone, we mother and daughter have a good talk. Tell your mother the truth, did you suffer in the Wei family?" "Never." Chu Yu smiled, showing a little tenderness on her face. It was a joy that could not be faked. Referring to Wei Jun, she said, "A Jun is very good, I like it very much." Xia Yun was relieved, nodded, and said, "It's good if you marry well. You're married, and I should also worry about A Jin's marriage." Speaking, Xia Yun set her eyes on Chu Yu, A Jin's marriage. Before she finished speaking, Chu Yu understood what Xia Yun meant. Xia Yun didn't want Chu Jin to marry Gu Chusheng, and Chu Jin didn't want to either. After all, the Gu family had fallen to such a level now. However, she would not let Chu Jin do as she wished. So she nodded and said seriously, "It's time to discuss the wedding date with the Gu family. The author has something to say." Small theater. Wei Jun, it's sad that I can't see the first chapter of my wife. Gu Chusheng, how do you let me live without seeing my ex-wife? Chapter 4. Chu Jin, I don't want to see my sister, not at all. About Gu Chushan's character analysis. After all, Chu Yu and Gu Chusheng have been in the world for 12 years. In fact, there is a lot of content, but I tried my best to focus on the first chapter, so Gu Chushan's transformation may not be very clear. But in fact, Gu Chushan's feelings for Chu Yu are that he has liked Chu Yu since he was young, but Gu Chusheng is a very proud person. He is very repelled by the strong Chu Yu, and he always thinks he is like Chu Jin. Later, after arriving in Huajing, Chu Yu kept arguing with Gu Chusheng because of jealousy and gaffe. This strong attitude made Gu Chusheng further reject her and sent her away from Beijing, but Gu Chusheng actually missed her for the past 6 years, but Gu Chusheng was the only one. He was used to being indifferent and selfish. He didn't know how to give, let alone how to love. And even though Chu Yu left Huajing, she was his wife after all, so Gu Chusheng never felt the loss of Chu Yu. But after Chu Yu died, Gu Chusheng finally lost him. He began to admit the fact that he liked that person for nearly 10 years. So this kind of emotional change is not abrupt, but more complicated. It is difficult for the characters to be completely written for you in 1 or 2 chapters. This article pursues a matter of course, and there is no forced emotional reversal. So don't worry about which character is portrayed deliberately to satisfy a certain plot. Hearing this, Chu Jin's face suddenly became ugly. She had cried with Chu Yu about her thoughts, but now Chu Yu still said that she wanted to discuss marriage with the Gu family, that is, she was not going to care about her. When Xia Yun heard this, she thought that Chu Yu didn't understand what she meant, and sighed, now that the Gu family is like that, how can A Jin be allowed to suffer? The meaning of being a mother is, you are married into the Wei family now, why don't you see if there is a suitable candidate for the Wei family? Now there is only one Wei Yun left in the Wei family who has not been married. Wei Yun is 14 years old, men usually get engaged and married from 15 to 17, and now Chu Jin is only 15, wait for Wei Yun in a year or 2, Chu Jin could have waited. Only a good person like Wei Yun, how could Chu Yu allow her own sister to harm others? So she looked embarrassed and said, this, I'm afraid my father won't promise it. Chu Jiancheng made a heavy promise that since he had promised the Gu family, no matter what the Gu family was, he would never regret it. Xia Yun listened to Chu Yu talking about Chu Jiancheng, showing an angry look, that old cow, you sisters, don't worry about him, I'm on my shoulders, don't be afraid of accidents. Ah Jin's marriage. While speaking, Chu Jiancheng's laughter came from outside the door. Chu Jiancheng walked in with the brothers Chu Liniang and Chu Lingxi. Chu Yu and the others quickly stood up and saluted. When Chu Jiancheng saw Chu Yu, he was very happy and patted Chu Yu on the shoulder and said, you are in good spirits. Ah! Chu Yu and Chu Jin are 2 sisters. Chu Yu has been with Chu Jiancheng and Chu Liniang since childhood. Before the age of 10, they grew up on the border. Chu Jiancheng did not know how to raise a daughter. Bento was raised like Chu Liniang. On the other hand, Chu Jin has been staying with Xia Yun in Huajing, so although they are sisters, they have completely different temperaments, and the attitudes of their parents are also completely different. Chu Jin loves to cry and is easy to be sad. Chu Jiancheng dare not scold or say it, but Chu Yu is different. In Chu Jiancheng's heart, this daughter is no different from his eldest son. Chu Yu was slapped a few times with such firmness, her face remained still, and she said with a smile, Father came back very early today. I know you're coming. Chu Jiancheng sat on the chair, Chu Jin poured him tea, Chu Jiancheng drank the tea and said, I'll bring your brother here first. Ew! Chu Liniang sighed, with some helplessness in his eyes, you have been wronged. He is also a military commander. He naturally knows that Wei Jun is not good, but he is not blaming Wei Jun. He just pity his sister for marrying someone who lives with the same head as himself. Chu Liniang and Chu Yu have a good relationship, and he took care of her since childhood. Unfortunately, Chu Liniang died too early in his last life, otherwise Chu Yu would not have fallen to that level. Chu Jin heard the eldest brother's sigh, and knew that Chu Liniang felt sorry for him, and his heart was sour and warm, and said gently, to marry into the Wei family is something that many girls in Huajing can't hope for. Good luck, Au is happy in her heart. Seeing that his sister was not as sad as he imagined, Chu Liniang felt relieved. Chu Lingxi leaned over, but asked Xia Yun, "Mother, what were you talking about?" Xia Yun was a little embarrassed. In front of Chu Jianchong, Xia Yun was too embarrassed to ask Chu Jin to find a home. Chu Jin pursed her lips and said nothing, but Chu Yu pretended not to know anything and said with a smile, "You are talking about Ajin's marriage." "Yes," Chu Jianchong nodded, "Ajin and Chu Sheng are also at the age of marriage. At the beginning, they promised to arrange Ajin and his marriage when you got married. This will let people divorce the book and give it to Chu Sheng. Now that the Chu family is in distress, Chu Sheng is a child who is arrogant, afraid that we will regret our marriage and refuse to take the initiative to bring it up." Speaking, Chu Jianchong said to Chu Liniang, "Liniang, you go to this matter." "Father." Chu Jianchong was stunned for a moment. He was very afraid of women crying. In the past, Xia Yun cried and he couldn't do anything. Now, when he saw Chu Jin crying, his head was even bigger. He bit the bullet and said, "You don't kneel, what's the matter? Weren't you satisfied with this marriage before?" Chu Jin kept his head down, shaking his head. Chu Jianchong asked, "What happened?" "But what happened to Gu Chesheng?" Chu Jin said hoarsely, and finally said, "Ajin doesn't want to what my sister loves." Hearing this, Chu Yu spit out a sip of tea. She thought about Chu Jin's thousands of reasons, but she didn't expect to pull her into the water. Chu Jianchong looked at her. Chu Yu hurriedly waved, I don't, I really don't care about Gu Chesheng. But this is not convincing. After all, she was clamoring to elope with Gu Chesheng a few days ago." Chu Jianchong hesitated, and Chu Jin then cried, "Since brother Gu and sister are in love, even if they can't be together, Ajin doesn't want to be caught between them." Chu Jianchong didn't speak. Chu Lingxi was a little moved, and said, "Gu Chesheng likes her sister, Ajin must have a hard time, and now the Gu family is like that, Gu Chesheng's injustice is ahead." Chu Yu put the tea bowl aside and listened to Chu Jin pushing the pot on herself and Gu Chesheng. She pressed the handkerchief to the corner of her lips and slowly said, "Ajin, what are you thinking about? It has become too fast." Hearing her opening, everyone saw it. Chu Yu raised her eyes and looked at her with a smile. "If you don't want to go to Gu's family to endure hardship, just say it straight, and talk around this corner, what's the need?" Sister said. Chu Jin looked blank, as if she didn't know what she was talking about. Chu Yu sighed, showing some sadness on her face, "I mean something to Gu Chesheng, don't you understand? I didn't like military generals before, but I liked civil officials, and the reason why I eloped with Gu Chesheng it's also because you told me that you don't want to go to Kunyang with Gu Chesheng to endure hardship. I feel sorry for you, you grew up in brocade clothes and jade food. What should you do if you get married?" Hearing this, Chu Jianchong was moved. Chu Jin grew up with brocade clothes and jade food, but Chu Yu grew up with him. Chu Jin didn't want to suffer, but Chu Yu could eat it. Anyway, Gu Chesheng is a civil servant. Our Chu family does not violate the marriage contract. It's okay for me to marry you. Anyway, you have always longed for a high-profile family, and you must be very happy to marry into the Wei family. It's just that Gu Chesheng doesn't look down on me. I sent money and elopement letters, and they all returned them, and said that I only like you one in my life. Look, Gu Chesheng's feelings for you can be learned from the heavens." Speaking, Chu Yu showed some sympathy. "Now that I have married into the Wei family, the marriage contract between my Chu family and the Gu family cannot be broken. But people always have flaws, and it's not a big problem. He likes you since childhood, and you will have a good life. You should marry. Chu Yu stepped forward and raised her hand to Chu Jin to wipe her tears. Don't cry, et. Having said this, everyone understands the whole story. Chu Jiancheng's face was not very good looking, and after holding it for a long time, he finally said, I said that Au has never had anything to do with Gu Chesheng, so why did he suddenly want to elope? Chu Jin, who taught you to be such a person who wants to enjoy the trend? Chu Jiancheng always believed in Chu Yu, not to mention that Chu Yu still took the letter that Gu Chesheng returned to her saying that she liked Chu Jin, even if there was none, Chu Jiancheng would not doubt Chu Yu. Hearing Chu Jiancheng's words, Chu Jin simply broke the jar and smashed it, wailing, I am a daughter's family, and getting married is a lifetime event, you don't know what the situation of the Gu family is now. You asked the eldest sister to marry the Wei family, and I married Gu Chesheng, where did you go? The eldest sister can be the concubine, but I am going to marry the magistrate of Jupin, my father, the same child, you, Chu Jin. Chu Jiancheng was angered by Chu Jin and shouted, what are you talking about? You look down on Gu Chesheng and don't let the eldest sister marry him, how can I marry him? Chu Jin no longer hides it, his eyes are full of resentment, I won't marry. Even if I die, I won't marry. Damn! Speaking, the servants came up to pull Chu Jin. Xiaoyun wanted to say something, but Chu Jiancheng stopped him with his eyes. Xiaoyun was still afraid of Chu Jiancheng, and held back all the words. Looking at Chu Jin being dragged down, he was full of distress. After Chu Jin left, Chu Yu stayed for dinner. Chu Jiancheng seemed very tired, so he went to sleep after chatting with Chu Yu. Chu Yu saw Ye, and Xiaoyun asked Chong Yu and Wang Yu to come over, and said, Mother, let me take the two maids back. Xiaoyun frowned, looking at the two girls standing behind Chu Jin. The two girls are slender and tall, one is quite beautiful, the other is very gentle, standing behind Chu Yu, she looks particularly outstanding. Xiaoyun was a little uneasy, dowry maids always look bad. I'm over there is no one available. Chu Yu sighed, the maids over there are much more talented and beautiful, but Prince Wei has no one in the room. It can be seen that the character is correct. I am used to using Chang'aiyu and Wanyu since I was a child, and I also bring some martial arts. They are here, I am much easier to act. Hearing this, Xiaoyun felt a little more at ease. Seeing Chu Yu's worried expression, she couldn't bear it, and just said, okay. Chu Yu got two maids, so she said goodbye and planned to leave. Xiaoyun took her to the door, and before she got into the carriage, she couldn't help but say, Agents matter, you better help. Chu Yu nodded and sighed, don't worry, mother, although she is ignorant, I will still help. But the Wei family is unlikely, the Wei family has high vision, Wei Yunhe is also the most favored son of this generation, and I am afraid that he wants to be the princess. I will look at other noble families, and if they are suitable, I will mention them. I heard that Wei Yun wanted to be the princess, so Xiaoyun gave up her mind, and no one could argue with the princess. She raised her head and glanced at Chu Yu, full of gratitude, I used to think that you were ignorant, but now. Au, you have grown up. Chu Yu's expression froze, and these words made her think of what this mother did in her previous life. She closed her eyes, sighed softly, shook her head, and got into the carriage. The carriage swayed, Chong Yu and Wang Yu sat on both sides of the carriage, and after a long time, Chong Yu brought tea to Chu Yu and whispered, Miss Eldest really intends to find it for Miss Tu a good mother-in-law. She has never been accustomed to seeing Chu Jin, but when she told Chu Yu, she only felt that Chang'aiyu was worried. But Chang'aiyu couldn't help but say it. Chu Yu smiled, naturally she couldn't let Chu Jin marry Gu Chesheng. Gu Chesheng is a powerful person, what should I do if I accidentally fly? Chu Yu pondered, her eyes shifted to Chong Yu's face, she heard Chong Yu speak ill of Chu Jin, and she felt a little uneasy in her heart. In her last life, Chang'aiyu was blamed by Chu Jin for this mouth. Chu Yu looked at Chang Yu and suddenly remembered those years. In the cold winter and 12th lunar month, she knelt in front of Gu Chushan's study, not far from Chang Jiahu's scolding. She listened to the board falling on Chang Jiahu, and desperately kowtowed to Gu Chusheng. She was injured on the battlefield, and it was extremely difficult to give birth. The doctor said that it was related to the martial arts she practiced. In order to get pregnant, Gu Chusheng abolished her martial arts. So at this time, when Gu Chusheng married Chu Jin as a side room, when Chu Jin was in charge of the inner house and blamed Chang Jiahu on the grounds of disobedience, she could only kneel like this and do nothing. In fact, she never regretted it. Until Chang Jiahu was beaten and she was powerless, she finally regretted it. Her love should be her own business, and no one should be implicated. So she cried and begged him. Gu Chusheng, I was wrong, she said, let Chang Jiahu go, let go of Chang Jiahu. I promise Heli, I will give up the position of wife to Chu Jin, I will take Chang Jiahu with me, go with Wang Yu, I won't bother you anymore, I was wrong. I'm sorry, I was wrong to like you, please let me go. Leave me alone. She cried and kowtowed, hitting her head on the floor and bleeding. Gu Chusheng finally came out. He was wearing an official robe and looked down at her. It's just a servant, so important. His voice is like iceberg, like cold snow. A servant can decide between you and me. Speaking, he raised the corner of his mouth and shouted, absurd. She couldn't cry herself, and reached out to pull him, please, I promise you anything you want, Gu Chusheng, for the sake of me being with you for so many years. Don't keep putting those years on me. Gu Chusheng said angrily, I never forced you to accompany me to endure hardships, you want it yourself. That night, Gu Chusheng did not save Chang Jiahu. In the end, it was Gu Chushan's mother who came to rescue. Chang Jiahu's injury was too severe, and she stayed up all night with a high fever, but she still didn't get through it. The winter was too cold, Chu Yu hugged Chang Yu's body until noon. She didn't speak or cry, she just held Chang Jiahu quietly. Wang Yu called her with a trembling voice, Miss. Like Long Yu, Wang Yu refused to call her Mrs. She raised her head, looked at Wang Yu, trembled for a long time, and finally said, let's go. So she left, taking the bodies of Wang Yu and Chang Jiahu, and left Huajing. She is afraid that she will not leave, and she will not be able to protect even the late moon. Remembering the past, Chu Yu closed her eyes, she stretched out her hand, and took Chang Jiahu into her arms. Chang Jiahu blinked in confusion, Miss. Chu Yu didn't speak, and said in a hoarse voice, Chang Jiahu, I'm here. This time, I will never break my arm again, this time, I will protect you well. He brought Chang Jiahu and Wang Yu back to the Wei mansion. As soon as he entered the door, Chu Yu saw Chun'er standing at the door. Chun'er anxiously stepped forward and said, Young madam. Chu Yu paused, looked at her appearance, and said coldly, Are you still here? Young madam, Haru, I knew that Chu Yu was making an excuse to have an attack, but she couldn't say anything, just said, You asked the servant to inform the second lady and left too quickly, and the servant failed to follow. Superior. Inform the second lady. Chu Yu raised the corners of her mouth. When did I ask you to inform the second lady? Chun'er froze. Chu Yu said calmly, I have already reported the trip with my wife, why should you report it with the second wife? Although Yang was called the second lady, she was only a concubine after all. Chu Yu is the eldest daughter of the Chu family, the heirloom concubine of the Wei family, and only Lu Suiyang is qualified for discipline, so there is no reason to report to the Liang family when traveling. Chun'er's face froze, knowing that it was a fairy fight and the kid suffered. Chu Yu did not embarrass her, and said lightly, Since you don't want to serve in my room, then go to the second lady and ask her to arrange a place for you. Young lady. Oh, by the way, let me tell the second lady that there are 2 more people in my room. I will tell my mother-in-law, but let her not forget that the monthly silver in my room is 4 more. Chang Jiu and Wang Yu were brought by her from the Chu family, but Yufan should not have been brought out by herself. After leaving this sentence, Chu Yu took Chang Jiu Wang Yu back to her room, and after setting up Chang Jiu Wang Yu, she listened to Wei Xiao's report on the daily life of the day, and then watching Wei Qiu bring a letter over. This is a letter from the front. Wei Qiu presented it respectfully. Chu Yu nodded and spread the letter. She thought it was Wei Yun's reply to her letter, but when she opened the letter, she found that it was a crooked dog crawling over the same words, and the whole page was full. It starts with, Sister-in-law Xian, I am Xiao Qi, is there any surprise for my sister-in-law? My eldest brother was too busy, so he asked me to write a reply to my sister-in-law. Seeing this opening, Chu Yu couldn't help twitching the corners of her mouth. She clearly remembered that the Marquis of Zhenbei wrote a good handwriting. She still read it in Gu Chushan's study. The font is really rare and beautiful. Rigorous and rigorous, with the chilling air blowing towards his face, he is thin and powerful, just like that thin and sharp young general. Why is this word now? Chu Yu sighed, reflecting on what she had experienced between the changes before and after, and a lot of distress emerged in her heart. If Wei Yun was born to be that of killing, she thought it would be fine. However, now knowing that before the Wei family changed, Wei Yun was actually such an ordinary and happy teenager. The comparison before and after made Chu Yu feel bored. However, she quickly adjusted. Fortunately, she's here. She read all the descriptions of Wei Yun carefully. Wei Yun was long-winded. How did Wei Jun get up? How did he eat? Who did he talk to? What did he do? How was the weather? How was he feeling? He had no details and reported to Chu Yu one after another. Chu Yu could vaguely see from this fragmented information that Wei Zhong's style of play was indeed very conservative. My brother-in-law always takes the things that my sister-in-law explained. Any rash move will be rejected, and my sister-in-law can rest assured. After writing for a long time, Wei Yun finally wrote a key and serious sentence. Chu Yu breathed a sigh of relief, and Wei Qiu next to her saw that she had finished reading the letter, and said with a smile, "Young madam, do you want to reply?" Chu Yu picked up the pen and wrote a sentence, "Practice your calligraphy well, continue to observe, and you will be rewarded when you come back." After doing all this, Chu Yu finally felt tired and took a shower and fell asleep. Before going to bed, she was always so uneasy, so she took the letter out of the bedside cabinet and put it under the pillow. I don't know why, but when the letter was placed under the pillow, she suddenly felt relieved, as if Wei Jun had come back. Wei Yun was still a teenager, the Wei family was fine, and her life was fine. Chu Yu slept very well all night. When she woke up the next day, she opened her eyes and asked Wang Yu, who came to serve, "Did the second lady send someone to look for it?" Wang Yu was a little surprised. She didn't know why she asked, but she honestly said, "Never." Chu Yu nodded and praised, "It's quite calm." Wang Yu didn't quite understand, but she was never a servant who asked about her master's affairs. She just followed Chu Yu's instructions, and after serving Chu Yu and grooming, she followed Chu Yu to greet Lu Suiyang. Chu Yu greets Lu Suiyang on time every morning, it is never too late. Lu Suiyang got up early in the morning. When Chu Yu went, she was already having breakfast. She greeted Chu Yu to sit in, and said with a smile, "You don't have to come and greet me every day. I don't have such big rules here. It's so tiring after so many days. My daughter-in-law always wakes up this early in the past. Now that the prince is away, I have nothing to do. It's always good to come to accompany you more." Chu Yu smiled and watched as the servant put on the tableware, and chatted with Lu Suiyang about some gossip. She and Lu Suiyang have different concerns. After chatting for a while, the two noticed an embarrassment of talking with ducks. Lu Suiyang was a little reluctant to chat with her, but he didn't dare to say anything because of his feelings, just waiting for Chu Yu to run out. Chu Yu glanced at Lu Suiyang and knew what she meant. She felt that this mother-in-law was indeed too impersonal, and it was no wonder that the main room was still there, but the concubine was in charge of the house. After thinking about it for a while, she finally said, "I came today to chat with my mother-in-law about internal affairs. Now that my daughter-in-law is married, she is also a concubine, and she should share the common affairs for her mother-in-law, but I don't know her mother-in-law. What are you going to ask your daughter-in-law to do?" Hearing this, Lu Suiang smiled. "You don't have to worry about it," she said with great confidence. "The second lady has always hosted the central feed in the house, and I'm not tired." Chu Yu. This mother-in-law is so heartless. But she had already guessed it, so she looked surprised, and then pursed her lips. This change in expression made Lu Suiang uneasy, and hesitantly said, "Does Au feel inappropriate?" "It's not, it's nothing." Chu Yu said it hard, and seemed extremely embarrassed. She considered it for a while, then raised her head and said to Lu Suiang, "It's just that my daughter-in-law will go out in the future, and I don't know how to tell other ladies. The princes and concubines of each family will follow the mistress to learn to preside over the central feed. When the princes succeed in the future, the power of the family will be handed over to the princes and concubines. Only the very unloved prince concubine would not care about anything." Hearing Chu Yu's words, Lu Suiang finally reacted. She nodded and said, "Yes, I have never dealt with them, but I have forgotten the rules." "Let's do it," Lu Suiang and Chu Yu said. "You and the second lady share the housekeeping. You should see how she does it first and learn from it." "What Chu Yu wants is this look." She nodded and then said, "If I don't think some people are suitable, can I change them?" "You can discuss such trivial matters with the second lady." Lu Suiang frowned. "It's just a change of person, is it nothing?" "Thank you, mother-in-law." Chu Yu smiled. "I knew that mother-in-law loves me." After hearing this, Lu Suiang couldn't help but laugh, and waved his hand. "What do you want to do? I'm going to copy the Buddhist scriptures." Chu Yu said goodbye to Lu Suiang, and brought someone to Liang's room. Liang is nearly 40 years old, and her body has grown, which makes her look extra family. When Chu Yu arrived, she stepped forward to greet her. If it wasn't for Chu Yu's shame on her yesterday, she would not have seen any gap between the two from her actions. Chu Yu and Mrs. Liang have come and gone, and finally explained the purpose of her visit. When Mrs. Liang heard Chu Yu's words, her expression froze, and then she said, "Yes, the young lady will be the housekeeper in the future, so it's better to learn now." Speaking of which, Mrs. Liang said, "Why don't you do it like this? Next month is the wife's birthday, this matter will be handed over to the young lady, and the concubine will also assist from the side." "What does the young lady think?" "I don't think so." Chu Yu spoke directly and looked at Liang Shi with a smile. "Au is young and still needs to learn a lot. I am afraid that it is inappropriate to host such a big event. The second lady learns by her side, what the second lady does, and what does Au learn?" Liang's smile couldn't hold back when she heard this, but Chu Yu's smile did not diminish. Liang knew that she would not give in. After a long time, she took a deep breath. He said in one breath, "Okay, then please ask the young lady to serve snacks and study hard." "Relax, second madam." Chu Yu bowed respectfully. "Au will study hard." Chu Yu did what she said. After lunch, Chu Yu came to the second lady's room and waited for the second lady to teach her. Wherever Mrs. Liang went, Mrs. Chu Yu went where she was. Mrs. Liang was upset. Chu Yu didn't speak when she saw that she was annoyed. She just followed for a day, until it was dark. Mrs. Liang finally tired. He drove Chu Yu out. Chu Yu took Change Iwanyu out of Liang's door with her forefoot, and with her back foot, she climbed over the wall with Change Iwanyu and left the Wei residence. "Where is Miss?" The long moon and the late moon have some doubts. Chu Yu took out a bunch of keys from her pocket. "Go get the keys." Wanyu was stunned for a while, but Change Iu instantly reflected, "This is why you asked me to put the requiem incense in the second lady's room." Chu Yu glanced at Chang Yu with a teachable child and nodded. "Let's hurry up and put her back before dawn." okay. Chang Jiahu shouted cheerfully and praised Chu Yu desperately, Miss, you are really amazing, I'm still thinking about how to let Mrs. Liang allow us to check the accounts. You know I'm checking accounts. Chu Yu feels that Chang Jiahu has made progress. She has always been better at her hands than her brains. Chang Jiahu said embarrassedly, Wang Yu told me. Wang Yu guessed what she was thinking, and Chu Yu was not surprised. She nodded to Wang Yu, but said, then do you know why I didn't take the birthday banquet? The master is the master, and Mrs. Liang is the concubine. The family knows that hosting the China feed, only Shi Liang can do it well. Yet. Chu Yu nodded and sighed, Wang Yu, I won't worry about you after you marry. Hearing this, Wang Yu blushed and said, Master said it too early. It's not too late, Chu Yu blinked, you're 16. Wang Yu was so ashamed by Chu Yu that she was speechless. Chang Jiahu laughed at her. Next to her, Wang Yu couldn't help but moved her hand at Chang Jiahu. The three of them sparred. In the weapon street I found a locksmith nearby, and after staring at the other party and setting all the locks, they played around on the street for a while before sneaking back into the room. Chu Yu greeted a little embarrassedly, well, good evening. Wei Chu sighed and wanted to say something, but in the end he couldn't say anything. Chu Yu thought this was the case, but the next night, she received Wei Yun's biography of flying pigeons. The dog-crawling words were even more scribbled, clearly showing the person's worries. Sister-in-law, don't climb over the wall to go out to play, there are organs on the wall of Wei's house, some places can't be overturned. Chu Yu looked at the 1,000 Miles Flying book, looked up at Wei Chu, who was looking down at his toes. After holding back for a long time, she couldn't help but ask, is carrier pigeon expensive? Wei Chu lowered his head and whispered, it's quite expensive. Okay, Chu Yu said with a sullen face, then let's eat roast pigeon. Wei Chu, he knew that what Chu Yu wanted to roast was not pigeons, but him. The author has something to say. This article is empty, so all names, please follow the author's settings. The author likes to write about people due to differences in IQ, force value, etc. I don't like to write about the wins and losses caused by social rank, especially among women, so I won't write about two lowly concubines, and the like. In addition, the plot of the house fight is just a transition, the main line is still how the heroine and the uncle grow up, the house fight is really just an earlier chapter. Please interpret this article according to the author's overhead habits. I don't like to write articles where women's status is too low and social class is too divided, and I don't like to use words such as aunt and wife. In the setting of my article, excellent women can participate in politics properly, and women in general can play and kill enemies. The main difference between direct descendants is the distribution of inheritance rights. In life, there will be different living conditions due to the status of the family and the favor of the family owner. For example, Liang Shi gave birth to 3 children, and has a good relationship with Lu Suiang and Wei Zhong. In this case, the status of the heroine is objectively higher than that of Liang, but if the heroine shows her face to Liang, on the one hand, Lu Suiang and Wei Zhong will be dissatisfied, and on the other hand, Liang's children will also be dissatisfied, and her children will be together with Wei Jun. Growing up, Wei Jun was naturally dissatisfied. Therefore, although there is a distinction between descendants and concubines, it is not used in life. Fiction is all about fantasy, so don't bother with these trifles.